My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today's episode is the last of a series on the Shijing, the book of poems, the book of poetry. In this episode, I'm going to take what I did in episode 2 of the series and extend that to its most extreme form. In episode 1, I talked about a big rat, a poem about rats that eat up the grain of a farmer, which is really a story about governments eating up too much in taxes. In episode 2, I talked about peaches and the lovely young woman, and I argued that Confucian-inflected interpreters of this poem over the past 2 millennium have long downplayed the sexual contents of this and similar poems. In episode 3, we talked about the miraculous birth of Huoji, the Lord Millet, an agricultural god of the Zhou people. In this 4th and final episode, I'm going to look at a poem that has been translated in a variety of ways. Stephen Owens translates the title of this poem as "We Had Our Delights." I am translating the title as "Spanking the Pan." Let me first read my translation, and then I'll read the Stephen Owens translation and a couple of other translations. Here is my translation. Spanking the pan. He spanked the pan in the mountain valley. The big man was happy. I sleep soundly alone, and upon waking speak. I swear I will never forget it. He spanked the pan on the mountain slope. The big man looked good. I sleep soundly alone, and upon waking, sing. I swear I will never leave him. He spanked the pan on the mountain top. The big man looks fine. I sleep soundly alone, and awaken in my bed. I swear I will never tell. Okay, so that's my admittedly provocative translation. We'll discuss more whether or not that's a justified translation. But before we do that, let me just turn to Stephen Owens' translation. This is the translation he has in his Anthology of Chinese Literature, a book that I think the world of. Anyone who wants to know a bit more about Chinese literature, this is really one of the go-to books that I recommend. Okay, here's Stephen Owens' translation. We had our delight. In the valley we had our delight, a big man free and easy. I sleep alone and waking speak, vow never to forget him. Upon the slopes we had our delight, a big man winning and merry. I sleep alone and waking sing, vow to never betray him. On the highlands we had our delight, a big man and a shrewd one. I sleep alone, then wake all night, vow never to make it known. Let's just jump into the translation and the difference. Stephen Owens translates this poem as "We had our delights." I translate this poem as "spanking the pan." The word that we are talking about is kao pan. Kao pan. It can mean to make delight, something like that. The Hai Hanyu Cidian, one of the main dictionaries that folks translating classical Chinese use, has someone annotating this word as follows: Kao, Cheng Ye, Pan, Le Ye. So the Guihai Hanyu Cidian here just says that Kao, it is interpreted as meaning to become. Pan is interpreted to mean happiness. So becoming happiness, having happiness, something like that. But if you look at the literal meanings of those words, Kao literally means to strike, to smack. There's a fricative nature to this word. And pan literally means wash basin, a pan, something like that. Owen, in his anthology, notes that many commentators interpret it in the latter way. That is, to strike, to spank, the washban, something like that. But a lot of Confucians have interpreted this poem in terms of politics. These Confucians say it's a poem about a civil servant who has left working for a bad leader, a bad king, and now is finding happiness in the simplicity of nature. But for me, and I'm guessing y'all have probably already figured this out, for me, this is clearly a metaphor about sexual intercourse. The fricative nature of that verb kao, to strike, to hit, to slap, to tap, to spank, all of these verbs work as translations. My choosing these words shows that I am not at all being subtle about how I think one should interpret this poem. No one's ever accused me of being subtle. But even if this is something that we can argue about, I think there's a case to be made here for thinking about this poem more in sexual terms. People today read this poem largely based off the Confucianists commenting on this and other poems from the Shijing in the Han Dynasty. This poem is written centuries before the Han Dynasty, however, almost a millennium before the Han Dynasty, depending on when in the Han Dynasty we are talking about. To me, the poem is obviously about sex, but Han Confucianists feel a bit icky talking about that subject. Now, think about the dilemma that Han Confucianists are in. There's no way they can avoid talking about these poems. The Shijing is the oldest collection of lyric poetry still extant in China, and it's one of the oldest collections of lyric poetry still extant in the world today. For Han Confucianists, that antiquity means that these poems deserve their respect, deserve their reverence. But somewhere along the lines, they say, we don't want to talk about the topic that they are obviously about, but we still have to talk about these poems. So how are we going to do it? What they do is they say that they are not at all about sex, and then they come up with this other means of interpreting the poems. Stephen Owen, when he translates this poem, he notes that these poems are hard to interpret. Owens is an amazing scholar, and he does a great job of noting the older interpretation of this word, that is, to strike the water basin. He also notes that Zhu Xi, one of the greatest scholars in Chinese literature, he's from the Southern Song, so we're talking about 900 years before today. Zhu Xi takes this word to mean ambling around, that is, kao pan. Part of the problem with all of this is there's just so much we don't know about these words. It's so easy to have this debate because these poems are almost 3,000 years old. Looking at these poems, me personally, I feel like spank the pan is the obvious translation. The word here that I translated as big man, that can be both a morally big person, but also just large in size. We see a clear sexual connotation, I think, in some other parts of this poem. It just makes sense to me to interpret this in terms of sexuality. That combined with other things going on in the poem, the fact that we're discussing sleeping alone, that the poet promises never to tell what happened, it just gives me feeling that everything in this poem is pointing towards sexual nature. But Stephen Owen is certainly not out of line in interpreting these poems in a way that moves them away from sexuality. Just to give y'all another taste of how my interpretation of this poem is often ignored, I want to translate Baidu's translation of this poem. So Baidu Baike is a great resource for those of y'all interested in trying to understand classical Chinese poetry, because one of the things they do is for many famous Chinese poems, they offer modern translations of the poem. So if you're trying to figure out what the poem actually means, you can go and look and say, well, someone writing for Baidu wrote, this is what this means. And you obviously can't take that without thinking about it, but Baidu Baike oftentimes acts as a good guide for anyone wanting to do poetry translation. And Baidu Baike translated this poem from the ancient Chinese to the modern Chinese, and I translated their translation. Here it is. So this is my translation of Baidu's translation of this poem. One built a cabin in the mountain valley. The great man lives in the breadth of heaven and earth. One sleeps alone, one wakes alone. Alone one speaks. Forever one will remember this happiness, but never be able to explain it in words. One built a cabin on the mountain slopes. The great man lives here in his cozy nest. One sleeps alone, one wakes alone. Alone one sings. Never will one leave this mountainside. One built a cabin on the mountain plateau. The great man lingers here. One sleeps alone, one wakes alone. One sleeps alone. In this is the happiness that cannot be put into words. A couple of things. First, this translation is so different from my translation, but also Stephen Owen's translation, that it just shows you how much flexibility there is in interpreting these poems. Second, like the original poem, this translation does not have a subject in a lot of places. So Owen, when he translates this poem, he translates it as "we had our delights in the valley." I translated it as "he spanked the pan in the mountain valley." In fact, both Owen and I are wrong, because as native English speakers, adding a subject to the original Chinese is something that is just natural for us. The original Chinese does not have a subject, and modern Mandarin can oftentimes do without a subject, even where in English you almost have to have a subject. It sounds weird if you don't have a subject for your sentences. So in that way, I think this translation by Baidu Baike is in some way better, more authentic. When I translated it, I had to translate a subject into my Baidu translation, so I just translated that as one, but that's an empty subject. But this Baike translation also has some real problems. I have no idea where they are getting this talk about building a cabin. I did not see that anywhere in the commentaries. Maybe it's somewhere there, but that is not what I have seen. That is just them completely pulling that out of their patootie. So where does all this leave us? First off, these poems are really difficult to interpret. All of these poems in the Shijing, you need to have commentaries to interpret them. Their language is just too old to read them without commentaries. Everybody is relying on commentaries to try and understand what the heck these poems mean. Second, these commentaries, though, they always have their own agenda. Oftentimes, they don't like talking about certain topics, particularly anything related to sexuality. Most modern translators rely too much on the commentaries to interpret these poems. For me, the commentaries are clearly covering over the bald sensuality of these early poems, and they give us some sort of balderized version of the Shijing. But if we go back and actually look at the poems and keep the commentaries in mind, say, okay, yes, this is what they say, this is how they interpret them, but we can clearly see this other thing going on here. If we keep that in mind, we look back and we get a very different understanding of early Chinese Zhou Dynasty society. The Zhou Dynasty society we see in these early poems is not the prim and proper world of the cleaned up one that Confucius would have us imagining. Many Americans think about the 1950s as a pre-lapsarian world of hop socks, a time before the sexual revolution. That is largely nonsense. The 1950s were not perfect, they were not clean, they were actually quite dirty in American history. I think a similar dynamic is going on when we have these Han Dynasty commentators imagining the world and the poetry of the Zhou Dynasty. They are projecting their own pre-lapsarian version of Chinese history onto the Zhou Dynasty. They're saying this was the time when things were perfect. They're idealizing it, but as they idealize the Zhou, they're also imagining out the things that they did not want to see. All right, that is about all I have. This is the end of my discussion of the Shijing. The series is done, but since I discussed Lord Millet in the last episode, I'm going to do a podcast on Lord Millet's Sima Qian in the Shiji. It's interesting how different Sima Qian's version of Lord Millet is from the poem that we did 2 weeks ago. I'm also hoping to have some guests on the podcast coming up, and then I will hopefully turn to more modern works. Actually, I will definitely turn to more modern works because there's pretty much nothing more ancient than the works of the Shijing. Okay, today's Chengyu is Yongshi Fu Shun. It means something like a determination not to forget. I translated it as, I swear I will never forget. But the Chengyu, actually, as it became a Chengyu, its meaning has changed. It means something like today, determined to never forget. The Chengyu comes from today's poem. Lots of the lines in the Shijing became Chengyu. The Shijing, the poetry is usually in 4-character lines, and the thing is quoted so much during the Han Dynasty that it turned a lot of lines from the Shijing into Chengyus. All right, this is as good of a place to end it as any. As usual, please check out the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. You'll find my translation of the original poem and also my translation of the Baidu translation of the poem. If you like what I'm doing, if you hate what I'm doing, shoot me an email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. I love getting emails from listeners, even if I'm slow to respond. Sorry, teaching is soaking up all my time. If you want to show your support, become a patron on Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast at patreon.com. I am Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.